Welcome to the Future of Ground Transportation podcast, where we discuss the exciting innovations that lie ahead for organizational ground transportation. Each episode, we cover topics tailored to those resolving transportation-related challenges and provide tips, tools, and trends that will inspire you to stay ahead of the curve. And now, here's your host, Daniel Perez.
Welcome to the Future of Ground Transportation. Today we have Mr. Carlton Reid. Carlton is a senior contributor of sustainability at Forbes and a writer of the Guardian on environmental issues, on the non-flight luxury travel for the Daily Mail. His books includes The Road We're Not Built for Cars and Bite Boom, both by Iceland Press by Washington, D.C. Carlton, welcome to the show. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. I mean, you're morning, yeah? So I'm afternoon. So I'm in the
Yes.
UK. So we're slightly different time zones, but we're both daylight.
Totally. So, Carlton, thank you again for joining us today on the podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background.
Well, thanks for having me on, first of all, Daniel. I am a transportation specialist in that I've been doing transportation journalism since 1989. So I went to university.
1989. Wow.
Yeah, 89. It's a long time. I don't even dare to add these figures up now. It's, I don't know, 35 years or something like that. So 86 was when I went to university and I became a journalist. And all the way throughout my 3-year university career doing religious studies, nothing at all to do with my current day job, I was a journalist for a bicycle magazine. And then as soon as I left university, I then set my own business up as an independent journalist, and I had a PR company as well. So I had two parts of the business and ran that for a few years and created magazines and sold those magazines. So I've sold about 4 or 5 magazines and books down the years. And I was very much a specialist in bicycling for an awfully long time. So that's all the magazines and books were generally bicycling books. And then about 5 years ago, I started working for Forbes.com, and then I became more of a generalist in that I would do stories on other forms of transportation as long as they were sustainable. So it was kind of, bicycling is definitely still one of my things to do, but I can also cover train journeys. I can, if a flight, if yeah, I know you're ground transportation, but if the transportation was in the air, and as long as it was an electric plane, then I could cover that. So it's got to be forms of transportation that are, depending how you define the term, sustainable.
Got it. Perfect. So, how do you went from a journalist to really focus in the transportation sector, whether sustainability or on the electrical space?
I've always fallen into everything. So I fell into journalism just by, I basically toured around the Middle East on my bicycle in the mid-'80s for 2 years before I went to university. And I went to a magazine looking for a back issue to carry on my journeys. And they offered me a job and said, can you write us an article on your travels? So I wrote an article about my travels in Turkey. And at that point, I discovered I could write not just essays, university essays, but I could actually write halfway decent prose and get paid for it. And so I fell into it. And then every single stage of my career since then has been just falling into it. So because I specialized in bicycling for a long time, I just carried on down that track. But then bicycling, when you're interested in bicycling and urbanism, when you connect those two together. So my bicycling was never just about, say, Tour de France or spandex. It was mostly transportation cycling, so commuter cycling. That was kind of my thing. So when you're into commuter cycling and reporting on commuter cycling, you very quickly fall into the category of being an urbanist also. So you're interested in the urban form. So I was then able, even when I was a bicycle journalist, to write about urbanism topic. So you then suddenly get very interested in how pedestrians also get around. Public transit, you become interested in that. Train journeys, you become interested in that, because they're forms of transport that are not the private motor car. So
Got it.
I do have a private motor car, but it's not something that I've really specialized in. So I have written about car journeys, but they tend now to be electric car journeys.
Got it. Got it. So, as an urbanist, as you describe yourself, what is your preferred method of transportation besides the bike?
Daniel, there isn't any better form of transportation than the bike. No, I like mixing it up. So, for the Daily Mail, which is one of the world's biggest websites, I write about my transport or my travels last year uh, on all forms of transport apart from the private motor car. So, but I'll also take my bicycle. So I'd have a folding bike. So I'd take my folding bike and I went all over Europe, as far north as Stockholm. In fact, I was reporting on the Tour de France for that. As far south as Sardinia, way down in the south and the Mediterranean. And I would always be on trains, ferries, but I always had my folding bike with me. So,
Really?
so virtually every time I am on a form of transport that isn't a bicycle, I'll always actually have a bicycle with me too.
That is awesome, Carson. How heavy is the bike?
Daniel, I have a few. Some are lighter than others. In my position, I can kind of call on some of the best bikes in the world. So I can, ask a manufacturer, could I please take this out? So I had a very, very lightweight Brompton bicycle. That's like one of the iconic British folding bike brands that's now very, very popular around the world. I had a titanium Brompton for one of my trips, very, very lightweight. And then at the other end of the extreme, I would have, slightly heavier folding bike from a Taiwanese company called Tern, the bird, Tern. And that was slightly heavier because you could ride greater distances on it. So it's more of a practical bike. So the Brompton was fantastic for folding, unfolding, and doing 5 miles, say, the either
Got it.
end of the transportation journey. Whereas the Tern, you could quite genuinely do, as I did, you can do 30, 40 miles very comfortably
Wow.
on it. So it's slightly heavier, but more practical for certain kinds of journeys. So I will take the kind of folding bike that I think suits that particular, multimodal journey.
Got it. Thank you, Carl. So, with the experience that you have touring all the Middle East and all over Europe, and I'm assuming that you had some really good thinking time with yourself and a ton of revelations. What were your sort of takeaways when it comes into sort of the infrastructure? I know one of your books is that cars should be on the road. Is that right?
Well, Roads But Not Built for Cars is a history book. So
Yes.
that was it's two halves, that book. One half was talking about how uh, the 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 middle class pushy bicyclists of both the UK and America in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s were the first ones to push for better roads. So the Good Roads movement, which was later taken over by the motoring lobby, was started by the bicycling lobby. And those early bicyclists actually morphed into motorists an awful lot of the time. So you scratch the surface of these motoring pioneers in the US, the people who founded the AAA, that kind of stuff. They're all started in transportation as bicyclists, and that's common around the world. When motoring came about, it was actually bicyclists creating motoring. And the other half of the book is about how not only was it the people from bicycling who created motoring, it was also the technology. So I know when you look at a bicycle and a car, you think they're two very different things, but actually they're not. They're very similar. The technologies in the for instance the first Ford car, we've got the invoices where Henry Ford went to the bicycle shop to buy the bicycle chains, to buy the bicycle wheels, to buy the bicycle. Almost, half that vehicle was a bicycle technology. The first differential steering on cars in America was done by a guy called Sterling Elliott, who was a major character in bicycling, in official bicycling, before he became a motorist. And he made most of his money from that differential steering patent that he created for bicycling, or his wife's tricycle, in fact. But it then became the differential steering, which allowed motoring to become quite popular. Bicycle tires, or pneumatic tires, they were invented for bicycles. They then later became, within 10 years, they then got put onto motor cars. But if you didn't have that, initial stage, you wouldn't have the pneumatic tire for motor cars. And then you've got all sorts of brands. I think I counted something like 76 marks, 76 motor car brands, which started life as bicycling companies. So if you know Land Rover, the Rover car company, which is a British car, but popular around the world. Well, that was originally the Rover Bicycle Company. Ford, I mentioned, with all the bicycle parts. Benz, who made the first motor car, he bought all his parts from a bicycle and tricycle shop in Frankfurt and Maine. The first car was hugely made up of bicycle and tricycle parts. So, there has been, in the last 60 years, there's been this kind of feeling that bicycling and motoring are these two separate things, two separate tribes. When you actually go back in history and look, where did motoring come from? If it wasn't for the bicyclists, you absolutely would not have motoring in the shape you've got it today. Even, some historians say, well, obviously you put a motor on a horseless carriage. That's just not true. You could not have propelled the first motor cars. You couldn't make them from these heavy wooden horseless carriages. You had to make them from lightweight materials developed in the world of bicycling. So the first use of aluminum was in bicycling. It then went into motoring, but it came from bicycling first. Ball bearings, even something as small and seemingly inconsequential as ball bearings, actually was certainly didn't actually get invented by bicyclists, but were totally perfected by the white heat of technology that was the world of bicycling before motoring came along and kind of stole its thunder. And we tend to forget how important bicycling was, before motoring came along.
God, thank you very much, bicycle. Sorry, Carlton. Uh, so now moving forward, Carlton, with fast forward 10 years from now, especially from all the cycling, and you're right. Thank you for the education, because I wasn't aware of how all these bicycles came into the trends of how transportation is now being innovated. If you were to fast forward 10 to 20 years from now, we talk a lot on the podcast about obviously innovation. What do you foresee in the next 10 years when it comes into smart roads? You talked about cycling as well. What do you foresee in the next 10 years, especially sort of with vehicles and smart roads?
If you take, say, New York City, and you say, Times Square, well, that was pedestrianized. And I don't think anybody would want to take that back to being, a motor route anymore. That's quite well set as now a route for people rather than just people in motor vehicles. So I think there's going to be much more of that coming along. So if you look at, what the UN is talking about with the climate change committee, if you look at what the grouping of mayors, international mayors, the C40s of this world, they are all talking pretty much the same language about restricting motor cars, for climate reasons, for safety reasons, for all sorts of different reasons. That the hegemony of the motor car if you believe the world's leading mayors, and why wouldn't we? Because they're all planning this, is to heavily restrict motoring in the future. So motoring is clearly not going to go away. There are unbelievably fantastic uses for motor cars, but the density of allowing motor cars to go everywhere in a city is absolutely coming to an end. So that's something that virtually every single global mayor of a major international city is talking about. So if you extrapolate to 10 years from what's happening now in places like Paris, which was previously incredibly dense with motor cars, has been transformed in 5-7 years to being not at all densely populated with cars in certain areas. So I think many more cities are going to have areas which are going to be no-go for cars. Currently, cars can go in. In the next 10 years, they won't. So on the periphery, cars will have a future. It's going to be long distance travel. Fine. Will you be able to get into many, international city centers in the next 10 years? Highly, highly unlikely. The trajectory is now clear from all sorts of points of view that restrictions will be placed on motor car use in CBDs, in
Yeah,
central business districts, in downtowns.
correct.
What you see in Paris is coming to every single city in the world.
Got it. So sort of the metropolitan areas, pretty much.
Yes. So I'm in Europe. So my kind of frame of reference is these very old medieval, in many cases, city centres, which were never designed for motor cars. And motor cars were let in, and in many examples, sometimes quite literally destroyed those city centres. I don't think they're going to destroy any more city centres for motor cars. That phase, it is a relatively short phase, that's at an end. It's going to be an awful lot of designing for transit, for perhaps driverless cars. I think that was, if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, then I might have said, oh, well, driverless cars could be one solution. But I don't think many, even the wildest of tech experts, are now extolling the benefits of driverless cars and anywhere near the same amount. Driverless buses, maybe. Driverless trains, certainly. Driverless trucks, even, from on major highways. But driverless cars in CBDs, I don't think that's going to happen anymore.
Got it. So
So we're looking at mass forms of transit are going to become much more prevalent in the future.
got it. Thank you, Carson. So that is a great point. So what you're saying is, overall, we're gonna have less and less commuters, especially in the sort of metropolitan areas, high density cities. But then, so you mentioned it's mainly gonna go into transit, uh, potentially driverless vehicles, autonomous vehicles. Um, what would be the challenges, right? If we were to fast forward 20 years from now, and we don't have the crystal ball right now, what would be the challenges that we will foresee if we were to go in that direction?
The
Based on
challenge of people, in that the reason we haven't got driverless cars, we have clearly you have them in places like Austin, Texas. They can very successfully drive around cities that were clearly built for cars, got incredibly wide roads, not many pedestrians around, lots of traffic signals. That kind of city, yeah, you can probably imagine a driverless car network working. But in many other cities that haven't been built, from the ground up for cars, then that's going to be much, much more difficult because people wander around these cities, clearly have always done so, since they were founded. They were founded for pedestrians, not for motorists. So they wander everywhere. So whenever you have streets where pedestrians wander everywhere, driverless cars can't really cope with that kind of thing. And we've seen many videos, of not just Teslas, but all sorts of different driverless cars struggling when pedestrians are in the picture, because a pedestrian can just stand in the middle of the road and block that driverless car if the driverless car is doing what it's meant to do. And that's why there's all these patents, which, from Google and Tesla, saying, well, we can't allow that to happen. We've got to, nudge the pedestrian out of the way. that's the tech bro solution. Well, that isn't going to be allowed to happen. Driverless cars will not be allowed to push pedestrians or cyclists or whatever out of the way. They're either going to have their own network of roads in cities, and where are we going to place them? We really haven't got the space in most, certainly European cities, and in many older American cities, you haven't got the space for creating a whole brand new network for driverless cars. So if they're going to be not able to mesh with people, then they're not going to be able to go into city centres. So driverless cars, the future for driverless cars is going to be, if there's any future at all, is going to be on the highways, on the freeways. As soon as they come into a city, they've got to then be piloted by a person. And that kind of knocks the usefulness of driverless cars down quite a few notches. Okay, you can sleep in your car and you can go from, all the way across, the US in your driverless car. But as soon as you touch a city, you can't. Well, do people really want a vehicle that, isn't going to be, door to door the same? So there are major problems with all sorts of technology where people are concerned. And if the cities of the future are going to be much, much denser with people, which is all the predictions, we're growing the population everywhere, all the cities are becoming bigger, then you haven't really got the space or the technology to also incorporate, these large motor vehicles. So people are going to rule the roost in the cities of the future. Underground transportation systems, overground transportation systems. Yes, there's a future for that. Pedestrians, many more cities are designing for pedestrians. So your podcast is about the ground transportation, and what I'm telling you here now is probably not what your listeners absolutely.
Sorry, Carson,
want
you're getting
to
a little
hear.
bit disconnected.
Oh, sorry. I'm just saying your listeners are probably don't want to hear what I'm saying here, but it's the trajectory.
No, and totally, and that's part of the main objective is not only to create that sort of roadmap plan as far as clarity of where we're looking to go, so that way for folks that are in the transit space, whether it's procurement officers or transportation managers, they could kind of sort of adapt because you said it. One of the main issues is the people, and a lot of times, especially for example, when Uber came out, just being mindful that this is the new trends and it's not going to change, right? So just being mindful of those things.
Yeah, Uber's slightly different in that, where Uber has been regulated by cities, well regulated, then the use of Uber does tend to drop. Uber was very successful in the first few years because it was largely unregulated. It wasn't anywhere near as regulated as your standard taxi services. That's one of the friction points. Uber was allowed to get away with lots of things that taxi drivers couldn't get away with, or taxi companies couldn't get away with. So I don't see
Correct.
Uber as being a model for the future, because Uber will be much more heavily regulated going forward.
Correct. I mean, overall, what I was saying earlier is just the awareness, right? As consumers, whether it's Uber or driverless vehicles, autonomous vehicles, it's just the awareness as humans that we need to start adopting because that's where we're going eventually. So switching a little bit of the subject, you mentioned sustainability, and I know that you have plenty of experience with sustainability. So, on a nutshell, whether it's ground, air, what are your thoughts in regards to sustainability? What are the biggest sort of hot bottoms that needs to be addressed and discussed?
Well, in the US, the Infrastructure Act that you've got there, that is very heavily skewed to electric cars. So clearly, the US administration, common to virtually all administrations around the world, are hoping and of course planning for electric cars, electric vehicles to take over, which sounds great. It kind of gets rid of the emissions. Obviously, you've no longer got an internal combustion engine pumping out CO2 and particulates and all sorts of nasties. So you've got rid of that problem, but it doesn't get rid of the problem of, at the end of the day, even though I'm a motorist and a car owner, a car perhaps might not be the best tool for one person to go and buy, a quart of milk from a shop. Maybe there are other modes that are better for that particular journey. So electric cars are fantastic. There's an electric car on my drive right now, but they're not going to be the answer to everything. And I do think that politicians and planners are relying too much on what they think of the future, and that is just a car, but just propelled by different means. And I think city mayors are looking very differently to national politicians. So the US Infrastructure Act is putting all this infrastructure in for electric cars, is imagining an electric car future. What are the cities? What are they thinking? They're not thinking that at all. So yes, they would like more, charging points for electric cars, but they're also looking big time at public transit and other means of getting people around, because the city mayors have got every reason to worry about the size of their cities in the future, and they've just extrapolated and thought, well, we are predicted to get this amount of people in this particular city, and we're already at almost gridlock with motor cars right now. So what are we going to do when there's 3 times the amount of people? So city mayors are way ahead of national politicians on this. It doesn't impinge on national politicians quite so much. It absolutely impinges on municipal mayors and city mayors.
Got it.
And they're the ones who are the most progressive on climate policies and the most progressive on ways of getting people around the cities of the future. And if you talk to a city mayor, and if you go to the meetings of these city mayors and you read the transcripts of what the mayors, these big cities, these are 40, 50 cities in America, same number in Europe, same on every continent. There's these lots of huge cities, and they're talking about restricting cars. And that's electric cars just as much as internal combustion engine cars.
Got it.
So we have a future where cars will still be incredibly useful, but they will not be used as much as they are used now for like every single small journey. That will be designed out. The cities of the future will design that out. You just won't be able to do that. And we are seeing that happening. It's leading to lots of friction in lots of cities where these measures are being put in place, and people are talking about, well, that's going against my freedom. I should be allowed to drive everywhere I want. But of course, when you drive everywhere you want, that's impinging on the freedom of people who aren't driving. So city mayors have got to balance this. And in some cities, for instance, we had the census in the UK, it came out 2 days ago, the transportation choice of people. In some parts of London, 70% of people do not have access to motor vehicles.
Wow.
So that's a huge thumping majority of people who you've got to cater to in the future. You can't just cater to motorists alone. So we've got to have a far more equitable transportation ecosystem rather than, as has been the case for far too long, cars.
Totally. Very, very well said, Carlton. And when it comes into electrical vehicles, what sort of issues and concerns do you foresee based on your perspective?
Right now, electric cars are pretty much for rich people only. So we're not seeing much trickling down. Presumably, in the next 10 years, we will see that, where the second-hand market becomes more important for electric cars. But it hasn't really taken off. It's mainly new. So when people are talking about buying electric cars, they tend to be new electric cars rather than being a very healthy second-hand car market. So we need to see the maturing of the electric vehicle ecosystem, and that won't come until there are charge points. everywhere. So exactly the same happened, in the early days of motoring, when electric cars and diesel and petrol gas-driven cars were equal at one point. The major fleets of New York taxis, for instance, were virtually all electric in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And then that just switched when it was just much easier to power taxis and cars with gasoline. And at that point, you had to have a rollout, and it was largely a private rollout of filling stations. And that didn't happen overnight. So the first motorists were these incredibly brave individuals who had to know how to fix their cars. You couldn't go out, on a long journey in the early 1900s unless you knew how to fix your car.
Totally.
And you also had to, as electric car owners now have this range anxiety, the early motorists also had range anxiety for where can we find gasoline, and it tended to be from pharmacies. So you could generally pick up gasoline from local pharmacies.
Wow.
And then the filling stations took their place. And once you had filling stations everywhere, that's when motoring hugely took off. And it really the same with electric cars. We really haven't got as many charging points that you would need to actually genuinely power everybody to get around in electric cars. When we go for long journeys in our electric car, you can be waiting 40 minutes to an hour at a filling station
Yeah,
until you get a free charging port. Well, that's not sustainable.
totally.
It's kind of nice and interesting right now, but it's not a practical method
Yeah,
of
and
getting around.
even if you pay for it, I was just talking to an Uber driver last week. He was driving a brand new Tesla, and he says that
Mhm.
every time he goes to fuel during the day, it takes him 30 to 45 minutes. I'm like, this is not
Yeah,
sustainable,
it's
you know?
it's a novelty right now. So electric car owners are kind of sucking it up. But there's going to be a backlash against that. People will start ditching electric cars if they don't roll out the infrastructure quick enough. And that's, in the Infrastructure Act you've got there, in similar uh, kind of similar stuff in the UK. They're talking about rolling out charging stuff. But when you look at when this is going to happen, you might actually have a backlash
Hmm,
of people, ditching their Porsche Cayennes and their Teslas because they can't physically get around in the way that they've been used to. And
got it.
the motor car, propelled by gasoline, where gasoline is available, within a mile of
Correct.
every single spot on the planet almost.
Totally.
Well, that's not electric cars. That's electric cars are pioneers again. Like the early days of motoring, which is kind of neat in some respects. It's not practical.
Yeah. And Carton sort of moving more in the direction for transit and municipalities with electrical vehicles. What are your perspectives so far from your perspectives? For example, in our end, we provide transportation services for Fortune 1000 companies, including municipalities as well. And when it comes into electrical buses, the cost of acquiring an electrical bus is 3 to 5 times
Mm,
as much as a regular vehicle. And a
hmm
lot of times when we present these proposals to a large institution, including a municipality, everyone wants the sustainability,
mm,
reduce CO2 and carbon footprints. But when it comes into paying the bill, it just gets
mm.
too costly. So there's a major cost barrier to
Mm.
entry. And I'm just wondering, based on your perspective, what is it that you foresee in more in the sort of commercial and transit space?
That's kind of going to be solved by with a mix of capitalism, in that the market will kind of equalize that. Not quick enough, so you will have to have, government and national and local government interventions here, which you already have. You've got some incredibly generous subsidy schemes for private motorists, and I'm assuming there's some pretty generous subsidy schemes also for larger vehicles to be powered by electricity. So there's going to be much more of that. If you're going to encourage the market to take over here, then there has got to be some pump priming. To use an analogy from the world of gasoline, there's got to be some pump priming to enable people to have the confidence that these technologies are the future, and that sticker shock, that price shock, has got to be weighed up with, well, look at the length of service you will actually get out of a standard electric bus compared to a diesel or a gasoline powered bus. So I think Hertz have discovered, certainly on the car fleet front, is yes, these things are much more expensive to buy, but they have virtually no servicing. And so, huge car companies who operate, tens of thousands of motor cars must have astronomical servicing bills if they discover that actually after 5 years of having an electric car fleet, the servicing bill is tiny compared to gasoline cars. That's going to make them realize, well, okay, that car was 3 times as expensive right at the beginning, but over its lifetime, it really, if not just balances out, it makes it much more favorable. I am assuming, I'm not an expert on the purchasing of electric buses, but I'm assuming similar must come into play in that, if you have a fleet of buses, then it's going to be cheaper in the long run to maintain these buses
Yeah,
than it is to maintain
correct.
gasoline or diesel powered buses.
Yeah, and that data and those expenses are not justifiable right now, but that's what we might
Mm-hmm.
see in the near future. So
And that's
Carton,
where municipalities come in. That's where local and national governments have got to step in and make it so. So
correct.
they offer incentives, or so it's the carrot and stick. So yes, the incentives are here. We'll give you a bit of cash as a subsidy to buy that vehicle, but also, and this is what many cities and nation states do also, is you then have the stick of, okay, you can have your gasoline powered bus, your gasoline powered motor car, but it's going to be much more expensive for you to drive that car or that bus.
I
So
agree.
it's you've got to have that carrot and you've got to have that stick, and it has got to be. It can't be left to market forces at the end of the day. Market forces will eventually make these things more cost effective, but it's got to be up to local and national governments to make it so at the initial stages.
Yes, totally. I agree. Thank you. Very well said. So to sort of finalize this episode, Carton, what is your favorite book, and what is the best advice you have ever gotten, whether it's personally or professionally?
My book, it's kind of an old one, but it's Tom Vanderbilt, and that's Traffic. Tom writes for Wired. He writes for all sorts of National Geographic, loads of different magazines, and he's written loads of different books on loads of different topics. And when he does get his teeth into something, it always comes out great. So if you're into this kind of uh, sphere, then Traffic by Tom Vanderbilt would be a really good book, even though it's quite old and it has got some, it's what, nearly probably 10 years old now.
Okay.
It's still really, really good on like things like how traffic jams, where traffic jams come from. You think that when you're on the road and you're going along, and suddenly a traffic jam, and you think, oh, there must be roadworks ahead, and you're driving along, and no, there was no roadworks at all. So why are we in a traffic jam here? And so the dynamics of traffic jams are fascinating, of
Okay.
where they just come from nowhere. And Tom Vanderbilt, in his book, explains that beautifully with all a bunch of experts. You asked me at the top there to think of some advice that I was given,
Yes. What is the
and
best?
I can't think of any. I really can't think of any
Well, what's the
that
best advice that
has
you have ever gotten, or what's the best advice you have gotten from yourself by doing, touring all over the Middle East or all over Europe? What would be the advice that you will give to all the listeners?
I guess just stay friendly. I mean, when I'm on social media, for instance, I get lots of grief from lots of people, as I'm sure everybody does. And you just got to stay civil, because if you act on social media in the way that you might do on the road when you're giving somebody the finger for whatever, which you shouldn't do either, of course, then that's not going to be good. So just treat everybody how you want it to be treated yourself, and that's actually the golden rule. So that's so as my religious studies training kicks in here, that's called the golden rule. It's common to virtually all world major religions and non-religious tenets as well, in that you just want to be treated well. Okay, treat others the way that you want to be treated. So that would be my advice. And if anybody's taught me that in my religious studies teaching over the years, that's kind of where I've got it from.
Perfect. Thank you, Carlton. And for all the listeners, where can we find out more information about you, your role, and to support you in your journey?
The hell site that is Twitter, if it's still around by the time this podcast goes out, if Elon Musk hasn't tanked it, then I'm on Twitter at Carlton Reid, R-E-I-D. And I've kind of chosen to stay there, in that I like Twitter, and it's been very valuable to me as a journalist over many years, and I'm not migrating anywhere else. So I hang out on Twitter, basically.
Perfect. So we will add it to the show notes. Again, Carlton, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. If you like this show, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much. You guys have a great day. Thank you, Carlton.
Daniel.
Cheers to you.
Thanks for tuning in to the future of ground transportation. We appreciate you coming along for the ride. If you found value in this episode and want to hear more, please make sure to subscribe to the show.